Of the three people connected with giving birth to modern dance in Europe, Rudolf Laban is credited by the other two, Mary Wigman and Kurt Jooss, with being the most important innovator and, in fact, their mainspring and guiding force. Without hesitation, they called him their master.
He was a man of incredible creativity, even if you were not talking about movement. We used to go out into the country sometimes on a Sunday, Laban, Lisa Ruhlmann, perhaps somebody else and me, and we'd make a pact that we would not talk about movement all day. Nevertheless, whatever Laban talked about, it was with a creative eye. He would see things, and the birds and the trees and the hills and the grass, and it was just so fascinating always being with him. And he would pick something up and a piece of paper and fold it in some way. He was an incredibly creative genius. I've never met anyone who was so creative, not just in his work, but generally.
I remember meeting Laban for the first time at one of these weekend holiday events which they offered, and I attended quite frequently. He was a dominating, powerful man. He wasn't all that tall, but he was very broad, and his eyes were very penetrating, and when he said something, you listened. There was no question of maybe arguing about it. At that time, I was very young, and he was very established, and he was the master. And it was what I always imagined the Eastern people have as a real master-apprentice relationship, which is very different from just having a good teacher. He was enormously inspiring, enormously charismatic, and in every way had a kind of point of view which was illuminating. He knew, his vision was so broad, and it was, for me, it was like entering a new world. And of course, I know I never caught up with him. I mean, now, if I knew then what I'd known now, I would have kept records of all our talks. I would have kept photographs and pictures and actions and records. I kept nothing, because for me, by the time I was working with him in Manchester and in Addlestone, it was just somebody I worked with. I knew he was great, I knew he was important. But I think I never really understood until afterwards just how important and how exciting it was to have open discussions with a person of that quality, of his whole attitude to life, with his background, with his enormous range of experiences.
In Europe, at the beginning of the 20th century, there was a cultural revolt against highly restrictive social roles and a quest for a freer lifestyle. Paris became a magnet for the avant-garde in fashion, theater, fine arts, and dance. In 1900, Rudolf Laban, the son of a military governor in the Austro-Hungarian army, came to Paris to study graphic arts, anatomy, and architecture. In that same year, the Paris World's Fair opened. For the impressionable young Laban, the milieu of the city, and particularly the splendor of the opening festivities of this international exposition, proved to be an eye-opening experience. Mingling with other artists, he was introduced to the world of the performing arts. He rented a small studio close to the Place Clichy, the center of dance studios and cabaret activities. The American dancer Isadora Duncan also came to Paris in 1900. Dressed in flowing garments and dancing emotionally to the music of a Beethoven symphony, she evoked the image of a Greek goddess. Refusing to follow traditional ballet form, she created dances modeled after Greek sculpture, using images she had seen in the Louvre Museum. Although Laban considered Duncan to be a strong performer, he believed movement should arise from the inner rhythm of the dancer, not from the music. Towards the end of his stay in Paris, his artistic interests had turned mainly to the exploration of the movement of the human body. Movement is the life of space. Dead space does not exist, for there is neither space without movement, nor movement without space, Laban said. In 1910, Laban settled in Munich, where he began to sketch detailed movement observations. He met members of a free body culture who shared his delight in moving freely without clothes. In 1913, he was asked to give a course in movement studies and to open a school of the arts at Monteverita, a Swiss mountain resort near Ascona. There he encountered a colony of nude sunbathers. The community attracted many artists and intellectuals, giving them a place to retreat from their confining environment. The group typified the revolutionary tendencies of the time. Laban designed movement studies and playful improvisations on the beaches and meadows surrounding Lago Maggiore. That same year, Mary Wigman received her teaching diploma from the Dalquoise Music Educational Institute. Émile Jacques Dalquoise, a Swiss music teacher, had established this institute for rhythmic gymnastics at Hellerau near Dresden. In addition to teaching music, Dalquoise followed the latest reform ideas about healthy lifestyles. His teaching method aimed to harmonize body and soul. Students had to learn highly structured rhythmic phrases that copied prepared movement sequences. At the beginning, Mary was very impressed. In fact, she had enrolled in the institute against the wishes of her family. After several weeks at Hellerau, she found that Dalquoise's insistence on moving in a prescribed format to given rhythmic phrases stifled her own creative sense of movement.
In 1913, I made my first pilgrimage to that beautiful hill referred to as Monte Verita. All I knew was that I was supposed to meet there the man of whom Emil Nolde had told me. He moves as you do, and he dances as you do, without music. That was Rudolf von Laban. He became my teacher. He was a moving spirit who opened the gates to a world I had dreamt of. I had not even reached the place when I heard in the distance a drum beat. I had no idea what to expect. Someone advised me to take a trail. This would take me to the ladies' sunbathing place. I had not even reached the place when I heard in the distance a drum beat. Aha! A drum. This could be Laban. I followed the sound, reached a meadow, and on the other side of the meadow a man stood in a white shirt and shorts, a drum in his hands, and a few girls and a midget jumping around. I was fascinated, staring motionless. Laban turned around and said to me, "What do you want?" "I would like to join you." "Laban, fine, get undressed behind that bush and come over here." I did it. It was like coming home. This wonderful feeling I will never forget. I stood there and suddenly, under the guiding rhythm of his drum, I felt marvelous. Mary Wigman.
The unconstrained spontaneity in Laban's improvisations and the atmosphere of naturalness gave Wigman a sense of freedom. She returned the following year as Laban's assistant. It was 1914. World War I was on the horizon. Very few students returned that summer because of the growing uncertainty throughout Europe. The school closed earlier than was planned, and Wigman and Laban stayed on working alone.
It also was hard work for me. Every movement had to be done over and over again, and it was controlled and analyzed, transposed and transformed into an adequate symbol. I had a pronounced sense for rhythm and dynamics, and my belief in living a movement and not just doing was strong. Therefore, my individual way of expression and reaction must have been as much torture to Laban as his attempts to achieve objectivity were to me. To point out the dynamic values of these movements, they were given names like pride, joy, anger. I needed little more than to hear the word anger, and I threw myself into a colossal rage. I was simply delighted to do them in a different, more personal way. Laban's anger was even more vehement than mine. He jumped up as if bitten by a tarantula. He shouted, "You clown, you grotesque monster, with your terrific intensity, you ruin my whole theory of harmony." Did I comprehend at all at that time what Laban had in mind? I was young and impatient. I wanted to dance. I believe the foundation of my career as a dancer as well as a dance pedagogue were laid in those few weeks. Mary Wigman.
At 𝒕𝒂𝒂𝒕𝒂, movement instructions were given outdoors. Laban built his system on the natural, organic movement of the human body. The principle of tension and release was the main element. His diagonal swing scales were a good way for dancers to warm up. Laban had organized these scales in a clear, directional framework which served to develop a group spirit and an awareness of the body's architecture. Movement sequences in sagittal, lateral, and horizontal planes gave the students a sense of space orientation. Laban used amateur groups in some of his stage productions. He believed in the educational value of synchronized group movement. Laban trained movement choir leaders in his schools, located in Hamburg, Berlin, and Stuttgart. He was inspired to create movement choirs by a vision he had of an art form which combined dance, music, and poetry.
In 1917, at the end of his third summer at Monteverita, Laban staged a huge two-day outdoor dance celebration. This event he called Song to the Sun. It was a communal event, and all summer students participated. It began at sunset and moved across the Asconian hillsides. Laban had also arranged for some ghostly apparitions to appear in the evening. At dawn on the next day, Wigman led everyone in a sun ritual. At the end of the summer school, Laban and Wigman moved to Zurich, where they began working in the studio of Suzanne Perrotet. The three of them worked with a small group of seriously motivated students to develop a method for preparing dancers for the professional stage.
Well, the relationship of Mary Wigman and Rudolf Laban is complex, a mix of professional and personal. And I think my reading of it is that the problems in their relationship began quite early in Ascona, when Mary was first a student and Laban was not long established. And at that time, Laban was infatuated with somebody else, that is Suzanne Perrotet, and really infatuated. If one reads the documents of the time, both between Laban and Perrotet, and one reads the diary of Wigman, you can see that Laban spends all his time with Perrotet. And he really is very, in my view, what can I say, unkind is not strong enough. I think he's quite brutal in that he does not pay attention to this incredibly talented student. He doesn't really give time to looking at her work, which she's longing for him to do. She's longing for him to comment on his work, and he doesn't do it. And if you look at, there are enough caricatures that Laban drew at that period. And Wigman is not at all pleasantly drawn. So there's an unfortunate relationship which begins in Ascona. And my reading of it is, and of course it's a personal reading, is that Wigman determined at that point, if she could not get his attention then, my goodness, she would get it in time, and what is more, she would surpass him. And I think that starts quite early on. And then you see, it's not long before she is actually far more successful in terms of theatre than Laban was. In fact, Laban wouldn't have got anywhere in Germany without Wigman. So already by 1920, let's say, she's the name, and he is Wigman's teacher.
Laban urged his students to explore what he termed their reach space, or kinesphere. Within this space are 3 levels: low, middle, and high. Laban and Wigman parted company in 1920, and Wigman never forgot the debt that she owed to her teacher.
A chance meeting introduced me to Rudolf von Laban and to the world of the dance, which was quite unknown to me. I was entirely unsuited to become a dancer. From the first moment of being in this new world, however, a complete change overtook me. I became deeply involved, my body changed, and my whole being gradually became part of this art.
Laban moved to Stuttgart, where he finished his first book, A Dancer's World. He was developing a more scientific view of dance that drew on his extensive research and experimentation with movement. Laban proved to be a meticulous researcher, taking minute measurements of the human body's range for moving in space. This systematic approach to movement led him to experiment with space forms created by crystals found in nature. On the basis of his findings, Laban established his theory of space levels. He called this theory 𝒂𝒂𝒕𝒂𝒂. Laban created scales of motion.
Jos immersed himself in his studies with youthful enthusiasm and thoroughness. Laban was now at a point where he required precision and accuracy for his newly formulated theories for moving in space. Kurt Jos came along at just the right time. He was exactly what Laban needed, a person who could retain all the material that Laban had formulated.
So, for instance, I mean, even outsiders couldn't understand what the icosahedron was, which was is a crystal, and even not a natural crystal, but a constructed crystal, and that the teaching of movement harmony and space harmony came out of that crystal, where we identified ourselves with the inner tensions in the crystal. Well, this was no doubt that was not emotional, but this was really brain work.
Yes.
And that played quite a part in Laban's work and in his work with us.
Yeah.
And I took up a great deal of these space harmony ideas, and then of course of the others which we called eukinetics, which was more concerned with not with which limb moves into which direction, but with the how, where we asked ourselves, well, all right, this arm moves in this direction, but how does it go quick or slow? Does it go strong or in a weak way, or is it successive in a way, or is it directed by the fingertip or something like that? You see, this is also the other side of Laban's sort of initiative ideas, which he hadn't got the patience to work out properly, and that he left to me.
In 1920, Laban established a performing group, the Tanzbühne Laban. Jos danced the male lead in the ensemble's production of The Blinded.
At that time, for the expressionistic dance in Germany, one did not need proficiency. Strong intensity was all convincing.
Laban's group received invitations to perform all over Germany, and Kurt Jos went along as Laban's assistant.
Now, in the early 20s, Laban started his main career in Germany. He had a short period in Mannheim at the Nationaltheater, and then he had nowhere to go. He got sponsorship of some sort eventually to go to Hamburg, but before that he had to fill the summer. So he went to a village, Gleschendorf, in North Germany, and took with him his whole company, some 40 dancers. They had nowhere to dance, no nice studios to go to, so they danced in what Sylvia Bodmer called the meadow, with its thistles and its uphill and its downdale. Now, what was he trying to do there on this al fresco summer school? Well, he was working on what is the nature of the new vocabulary for the new German dance. And he's looking at what he'd inherited, what he'd received, which was an art form with a received vocabularies of movement, namely from ballet, from social dance, and from folk dance, and a tradition of mime, and of course a complete dependence on music. Now, those three dependencies Laban determined to abandon. He said they will not do for the 20th century, they will not do for a liberated human being from the fetters of convention, and he set about finding a new one. Well, where do you find it? If it's not the one you've got to find it from somewhere. So he's saying it is within each individual. Each person has got movement possibilities, movement vocabulary within them. And so he's using improvisation as his main means of finding movement. Well, how do you set that about? The normal way is to say, act, imagine, use some narrative line. Well, he's not doing that. So he's saying, what have I got then if I haven't got a narrative? Well, I've got a human body, and I've got the actions they can do. I've got the dynamics with which they can move. I've got the space in which they can move, and the spatial forms that they can create. And I've got the relationships between themselves, each other, the relationships within the body itself, and I've got the relationships that they can create with the sound they make and the space that they're in. That's where he began, and that was what he was setting out to do in the summer school at Gleschendorf.
While working in Gleschendorf near Hamburg, Dr. Niedecken Gebhardt, one of Germany's avant-garde opera directors, observed Jos arranging a movement choir with amateurs. He engaged Jos as movement director for his Neue Tanzbühne in Münster for the coming season. Jos brought a group of young men together and trained them in Laban's method of movement choir. In 1924, Laban had to disband his own group for several months due to economic hard times in Germany. But under Ducia Bereske, his new associate, the ensemble acquired truly professional training and renamed themselves Kammertanzbühne, Chamber Dance Stage Laban Bereske. The group performed 3 of Laban's pieces at the First Dancers' Congress in Magdeburg in 1927, The Knight, Ritter Ballet, and Fool's Mirror. Laban danced as soloist with his ensemble. It was to be the last time that he performed on stage. He retired as a performer soon after due to health problems. While still in Hamburg, Jos had begun a collaboration with a young dancer named Sigurd Leder. They prepared a program called Two Male Dancers. In 3 successful years, the Neue Tanzbühne Münster made its name known in Germany with such contemporary productions as The Demon, to music by Paul Hindemith. In 1927, during their summer vacation, Kurt and Sigurd traveled to Vienna to study ballet. After that, they went to Paris to visit Laban's associate, Ducia Bereska. She introduced them to Laban's new discipline called eukinetics. This was a term Laban gave to his theory and practice of movement expression. Both men were fascinated with this new approach. They experimented with the study of dynamics and rhythm.
I'm very strongly influenced by his ideas and what he gave to us when we were his pupils in the beginning of the 20th. That was, well, he was decisive for our whole artistic outlook, because we were very freely educated by him, and at the same time also we were very enthusiastic about working with him, because he gave us a new outlook on artistic values, which without him would never have occurred to us.
That fall, the city of Essen approached Kurt Jos with the idea of establishing a dance department within a new school that would combine music, theater, and dance. The city was going to subsidize this new endeavor, which would be called the Folkwang-Schule. With good practical sense and a clear understanding of contemporary German theater, Jos seized this opportunity to implement Laban's motto, Tanz, Ton, Wort. Dance, sound, word.
In school and studio, the new dance technique must be developed toward a non-personal, objective tool for the dramatic dance, the technique of traditional classical ballet to be gradually incorporated. Jos's bar is not the same as the classical bar. The emphasis is on the active use of weight. The whole body is in action. There is an emphasis on the mobility of the hips. The choroitic aspect of the bar exercises is the use of diagonals, and the eukinetic aspect is the dynamic weight flow.
Jos also established the Folkwang Dance Theater Studio, an experimental professional dance group. F.A. Cohen, a composer, and scenic designer Heinrich Heckroth were to be his artistic collaborators, along with soloist Aino Simola, Jos's wife.
Our aim is, as always, the dance theater, understood as form and technique of dramatic choreography, concerned closely with libretto, music, and above all, with the interpretive artist.
Aber Jos, und da muss ich ihn also 100% unterstützen, hat immer gesagt, wenn man ihm zum Beispiel vorgeworfen hat, warum kodifizieren Sie nicht Ihre Sachen?
Always used to say, it is my aim to give the pupils the greatest possible consciousness of movement. The style, the kind of dance, that's the choreographer's business.
You see, way back in the 20s, we used to say, well, dance is sovereign. You can do everything in dance. You can every theme can be treated as a subject of a dance. So I think this was grossly overestimated, and not only I, but I think quite a number of my colleagues have learned in the meantime that not everything is a good subject for dance. And I personally have been saying for a long time that to me dance is the art of will, the art of acting. That means of doing, not of feeling. Music is feeling and sentiments and so on, but dance is after the sentiment. First the sentiment, and that creates a movement of the will, and then the will create a movement, an external movement.
Yes.
And only things which are which can be understood in the widest sense as action are suitable for dance. In action, you can't dance.
When Wigman left Laban in 1920, she went on tour with her solo program to several German cities. In Dresden, the concert hall was sold out. Her performance was a huge success. The State Opera of Dresden intended to engage Mary Wigman for the open position of ballet master, but in the end, she never got the job.
Many weeks had passed since I had signed the agreement with the opera house. Now I waited and waited for their letter of acknowledgement. It did not arrive. I had to learn from a newspaper report that the position was given to a rather unknown dancer to whose lover and friend the opera management was financially indebted. Voila! What to do? Here I was in Dresden without any form of support. I decided to stay and open my own school. From everywhere young people joined my classes, and their interest in working with me was great. Overnight I had a school which from the first day of its existence was called Wigman School Dresden. I also had to develop my technique without any help, and had to try and test everything on my own body. Therefore I knew how to convey my experiences to other dancers.
Dresden was the center for German Expressionism. Artists like Ernst Ludwig Kirchner and Erich Heckel became close friends of Wigman. They enjoyed coming to her studio and sketching while Wigman explored movement material for her solo dance program. Percussion was the preferred accompaniment for Wigman. Her routine was to work an hour a day with a musician. She developed a variety of movement phrases which she later explored with her students. She adopted a method of teaching based on Laban's theories. She modified them to her own liking. Indeed, she never considered this method of teaching as a technique. Rather, she referred to her classes as dance practice. She also introduced an emotional quality to her movement and encouraged her students to find their own individuality, to be themselves, not to copy, but to feel the movement. Her dance practice culminated in group improvisation. Wigman's movements came directly out of her body's breathing. They were not confined to Laban's spatial structures. However, Wigman did agree with Laban that dance should develop independently of music. Her students were given instruction in percussion instruments, and they became aware of how rhythm arises out of the body's motion. In 1928, at the Second Dancers' Congress organized by Curtius, Laban and Wigman were reunited after being apart for 8 years. Although Laban and Wigman had developed in very different directions, the work of both artists was hailed by the conference participants. The Second Dancers' Congress served as a review of the different directions that free dance had taken in Germany. The Congress opened with Laban's presentation of his dance notation system. This was a new method of writing down and preserving dance works for future generations. The following day, Wigman appeared with her chamber dance ensemble. The leading dancers were Hanya Holm, Ivan Georgi, Gret Paluka, and Bertha Trumpi. The group danced Wigman's latest piece entitled Celebration. The performance was an hour and a half of constant, vigorous motion, showing a very clear choreographic structure. The choreography won over her harshest critics, and Wigman was acclaimed one of the leading choreographers in Germany. 1928 was also the year of Germany's worst depression. The theaters were on the verge of being closed, people were out of work, and with good reason, the question put before the Congress was, what is the future of dance on the German stage?
The question of where is the new dance going? And that's very clearly the question mark in the 1928 conference is well known. And it was either going to be, well, German dance stays on its own and becomes something quite special on its own, or German dance sees itself as being simply a gradual and organic development of ballet. Now, Jost goes in that direction, and Wigman goes in the former direction. And Laban really favors, not exactly either, but preferably the Jost position. And you see that what Laban is trying to do is to set up trade unions for all dancers, whether they're folk dance, whether they're ballet, whatever they are, all together to try to get some kind of security of employment for all dancers. Wigman will have nothing to do with it, and indeed sets up a quite separate trade union for her kind of dance. He regards that as counterproductive and rather egocentric. And so it goes on. And then in the 30s, obviously, Laban is in a position where he could, or rather, Wigman believes that Laban could have provided her with a post in 34 and again in 35. And by that time, the relationship is really smouldering, particularly on her side. And he's just carrying on.
Laban and Jost were pragmatic. They knew that the new dance had a better chance of survival as an integral part of the theater. They believed that this new art form had much to offer and should be coordinated with drama and music. In contrast, Wigman felt strongly that ballet and the new dance were incompatible. It was hard for her to imagine the two art forms coexisting, and ironically, the following morning, Wigman announced that she had to disband her company for financial reasons. When the conference was over, Wigman returned to her school in Dresden. In 1930, Saul Urach, the American impresario, persuaded Wigman to come to America. At first, Wigman hesitated. She had misgivings about how the American audiences would respond to her art. However, the invitation came at just the right moment.
And the last tour of Art and Pavlova in the United States in 1926. And I asked her what she thinks of Barry Wigman. It was a little bit later in 27, 28 practice. She said, by all means, bring her over to the United States. And I went to Dresden and made the arrangements with her, but I signed a contract. In 1930, she arrived here alone with a pianist and a percussion instrument. And all the great people were very interested in her to see her work. It was a great success.
It was agreed that she would give a series of solo performances in New York and toured the United States. In December of 1930, she set sail for America on the SS Bremen. The American Concert Dancers League in New York held a reception to honor Mary's arrival. The hosts were the leading names in American modern dance: Ruth St. Denis, Ted Shawn, Martha Graham, and Doris Humphrey. Harold Kreutzberg, returning from a tour on the West Coast, was also on hand to greet his former teacher. The house was sold out. Mary was very nervous. The dances were filled with turbulence and emotional conflict. The audiences had never seen anything like it. I particularly remember Faces of the Night. I remember her first crossing from left stage to right to be very compelling and very moving. After this initial dance, which was met with much enthusiasm by everybody, I personally, and also my friends from the Martha Graham Company, well, we had been rehearsing all day and came directly to the theater. We too were in a state of tension to see what we would see. My reaction was that this was a foreign language. I felt that I was in the presence of some great artist. The accompaniment was a single piano, much like our sparse American dance accompaniment, so that was not strange. What was more foreign was perhaps the visual look of the costume, with bare midriff and a medallion hanging from the brassiere, probably showing the belly button, which seemed to us what Martha Graham called, in our long woolen period, somehow extravagant and different. The subject matter seemed universal, but we had to get used to its type of universality, because she did dances into death. She also was doing summer dances. I was fascinated. I was impressed. I viewed it with respect, but it was foreign. Martha Hill.
Miss Wigman owes curiously little of her success to externals. She has no scenery at all beyond curtains. Nearly all her most original dances are unaccompanied by music, and her costumes, although striking, have little of the elaborateness of the star dancer's attire. It is rhythm, above all, that she emphasizes. Herman Gould.
After her New York performances, she left for her cross-country tour. Urach was so taken by her success that he arranged for Wigman to establish a branch of the Wigman School in New York, headed by her assistant Hanya Holm.
When Mary Wigman brings her first American season to an end on Friday night, she will cause the curtains of Carnegie Hall to close on one of the most memorable adventures in the history of dancing in America. In the comparatively brief period of 10 weeks, she has brought to issue differences which have been stirring under the surface for years, but have lacked the impetus strong enough to bring them to action. John Martin.
Wigman's first American tour was so successful, both financially and artistically, that Urach brought her back for the next 2 seasons. The enthusiasm on the first tour was repeated, but even more forcefully on the second tour, and America lay at her feet. The audiences greeted her spontaneously with their acceptance and their approval. The constant traveling in Pullman trains and Greyhound buses proved to be very tiring and exhausting. But the openness of the continent and the fascinating landscapes made a strong impact on her.
I was looking forward to performing since I had been able to train extensively. I was feeling very fit in spite of the endless train trip that took us 3 days and 3 nights from New York to Los Angeles.
During an intermission of one of her concerts in Los Angeles, Albert Einstein visited her dressing room. A photographer snapped their picture. The next morning, a story appeared in one of the Los Angeles papers. Einstein was asked what he thought of Mary Wigman. His answer? "She knows what she's doing, but I can't figure it out." The same picture appeared in a San Diego newspaper a few days later with the heading, "Mary Wigman, dancer who will appear at the Savoy Theater tonight, promised to explain her dances to Professor Einstein if he would explain his theory of relativity to her." It was Einstein who implored her to take a trip through the desert to Palm Springs. "Only then," he said, "will you know what California is like." Wigman fought hard for this trip and had her itinerary changed. It turned out to be one of her most unforgettable experiences.
I love America. I was told I would not like it, that I would long for Germany when I came last spring. I liked it so much and missed it so much when I returned across the water that I was almost ashamed to acknowledge to myself that this was so, for Germany is home. There's something in the air, and it is the life of America that takes possession of the imagination.
She arrived with a group of 12 dancers. This was to be her 3rd and last tour. The public and the critics were considerably less enthusiastic this time around. They wanted to see Wigman, the soloist, not a group composition. Wrote one critic, "Her ample presence required no reinforcements, so that these Teutonic Amazons seemed extraneous." Jurok was more direct. It was a dismal flop. In March of 1933, Mary Wigman returned to Germany, where she saw that life had changed. Her first meeting with officials from the propaganda ministry was disheartening, to say the least. She was told that the subsidy for her company would be terminated. She would also have to show proof of her Aryan ancestry, as well as the background of her instructors.
In 1930, Cosima Wagner, the widow of composer Richard Wagner, had asked Rudolf Laban to arrange and choreograph Götterdämmerung, Parsifal, and Tannhäuser for the Bayreuth Festival that same year. Bayreuth was the most prestigious musical event in Europe. The great conductor Arturo Toscanini was the musical director. Laban asked Jost to be his choreographic collaborator. Both men were equally acclaimed for this highly successful theatrical event. It turned out to be the climax of Laban's career in Germany. Following his triumph at the festival, he took up his new position as director of dance for the Staatsoper Unter den Linden in Berlin. His next 3 years were very productive. Laban was quite successful in his new position working with the ballet-trained dance ensemble. After Bayreuth, Jost returned to Essen and took over the Essener Opera Dance Ensemble as ballet master, tightening the collaboration between his Folkwang Dance Ensemble and the opera soloists. In the winter of 1931, Jost was invited by the Chorégraphique Archive Internationale to submit an original choreography. In January of 1932, he agreed and started with rehearsals. The new project was to be called The Green Table. The idea of the piece had its roots 10 years earlier.
I'd seen the famous Lübecker Totentanz, a sequence of pictures of all sorts of people dancing with death, who was portrayed as a skeleton. It seems to have been in the medieval period when people's minds were occupied with this sort of dancing, which actually was a symbolic expression of the fact that everyone would die the way he had lived. Death danced with the beggar with a bagpipe, and it was quite a nice and obviously jolly dance. In another picture, he danced with a middle-aged peasant woman who had a baby in her arms, obviously stillborn. He danced with a courtesan and was rather fierce with her, and he danced with a bishop who was obviously not a too good bishop. Then with a king or emperor or something like that. This was, I thought, a fascinating subject.
The green table begins and ends with the same scene. Gentlemen in black around a green table.
I don't know, and I still don't know, who the gentlemen in black are. I don't think they are diplomats. There may be one or two diplomats between them, but I think they are all the powers which can gain in a war, which, in the end, through their machinations, cause a war. I think the reason I used masks was not to make the diplomats invisible. Rather, we had only 16 dancers, and the scene had to change very quickly, and they had to change costumes, so there was no possibility of makeup. We also had to use women in the table scene, yet they couldn't look like they look afterwards in the human scenes. They had to look grotesque. So what to do? Well, wear masks. It was purely a practical thing.
The concours de chorégraphie was an international competition held in Paris in 1932 at the Théâtre des Champs-Élysées. 20 choreographers were invited to take part over a period of 3 days from July 2nd through the 4th. The Green Table had its premiere on July 3rd. At the end of the performance, there was a standing ovation. It was an unforgettable occasion, a veritable revelation. The award of first prize was given for this choreographic drama. Its success was immediate and overwhelming, the public enthusiastic, the press unbounded in its praise.
1932 was an important year, of course, because it was the choreographic competition in Paris when Curtius won the prize with his incredible work, The Green Table. Now, Laban's part in that was quite small, obviously. He was simply part of the jury. But what is interesting was, to me, was his response to it, because he was overjoyed with the work. What also is important for Laban is that he recognizes in 1932 that Jos is a far better choreographer than he is himself. And already by 1932, Laban has really decided that he's not much of a choreographer.
Diary entry, Essen, 1932. During August, the daily difficulties with the Nazis are constantly increasing. F.A. Cohen have already been discharged from their jobs by the city of Essen. I am fighting to keep my Jewish, half-Jewish, and quarter-Jewish members, who officially cannot be fired because Ballet Jos is under private management. My disputes with the area commander at the headquarters of the Nazi Party are increasing daily. 2 weeks before we go on tour to Holland, I get a message from some Freemason friends that I'm about to be taken into protective custody and that I should leave Germany immediately. A plan is worked out, and 2 days later, myself and the entire company crossed the Dutch border.
After crossing the border, Jos had no idea where the company would finally settle. They began their world tour performing in Western Europe, England, and the United States. Beside the Green Table, the repertoire consisted of Big City, Ball in Old Vienna, and Pavane. Ballet Jos was the only company in its day that combined elements of classical ballet with a modern approach to movement. It was truly a modern dance company. While touring in America, Jos was invited to set up his school in Dartington, England. He returned to England, and the company would join him later.
Of all the European attractions scheduled to appear in this country this season, the Jos Ballet, which opens a limited engagement, is in many respects the most significant. For one thing, its technical method is a reconciliation, at least in intent, of the classical ballet and the modern dance. For another thing, the principal item in its repertoire, the Green Table, is the first ballet produced outside the USSR to employ a social theme. Couched in the form of a medieval dance of death, it is an impressive tirade against war, bitter in its invective, yet altogether compassionate. In at least these two respects, Mr. Jooss is making important contributions toward the redemption of the ballet from its pretty inconsequence as a merely decorative art. Perhaps another noteworthy feature of the organization is that it has no stars. Jooss himself dances only occasionally. In the first program to be offered here, he is to appear in only one of the 4 numbers. Certain dancers play more important roles than others, but it is distinctly as an ensemble that the company functions. Though the organization came into being as the Folkwangsbühne in Essen, it is in no sense a German organization in the meaning that term has recently acquired. Its international character is maintained in its personnel as well as in its outlook on various techniques and in its selection of subject matter. It is perhaps interesting to note in this connection that the company of 25 contains 6 Jews, one of whom is Fritz A. Cohen, the musical director and close collaborator of Jooss for a number of years. John Martin, New York Times, 1933.
Jooss was not the only one having problems with the Nazi regime. Laban also had his share of difficulties. In 1934, his contract with the Staatsoper in Berlin was not renewed. However, he was offered a 6-month provisional contract with the Deutsche Tanzbühne in Berlin. What had been a professional dance organization was now taken over by the propaganda ministry headed by Joseph Goebbels. Laban's job was to organize and create artistic dance works and to promote young German dancers, especially those unemployed due to the recession.
The impression I got was that he was certainly very, very highly respected in Germany, that he had been involved in some committees with Hitler and other people associated with Hitler.
Goebbels was in charge of planning the opening ceremonies of the 1936 Olympics to take place in Berlin. He asked Laban to assist him in the preparation and to choreograph a festive work for the opening night ceremony.
When Laban rehearsed the mass spectacle of the fresh wind and the new joy, which was supposed to accompany the opening of the Olympic Games in 1936, it became evident that his aesthetic approach to mass movement and movement choir and choric work collided decisively with the Nazi ideology. Laban's choric work is based mainly on the idea that the individual should experience a group as an harmonious system. His social utopia was that it was possible to transfer this idea of a harmonious experience in a group to society, to mankind even. That was his metaphysical approach to dance. The Nazis wanted the group, the mass, only to demonstrate power. The experience of the individual was intended to be that as an individual, as a single person. They wanted the single person to realize that only as a group, as a whole, he is worth everything. That is, he is the ideal of the new German people. Goebbels, the Minister for Propaganda, he was a very intelligent man. He realized this difference between Laban's aesthetic approach and the Nazi ideology. The whole performance was called off, and they put a piece in the place that glorified war.
We have to distinguish between the games themselves, which were fundamentally sport, obviously. They are Olympic sport. And surrounding it is a completely different artistically based cultural program. Now, Laban has nothing to do, categorically nothing to do, with the Olympic Games or anything that went on in the stadium. And he has everything to do with the cultural program that surrounded it. Now, one reads sometimes that he masterminded the opening ceremony at the Games. This is absolutely erroneous. He did not. Neither was he asked to do so, and if he had been asked, he would surely not have agreed. Now, why wouldn't he have agreed? You could think it might be a wonderful job. But for him, it wouldn't be at all, because at that time, it seems to me, looking at the correspondence that I've studied in the archive of the Reichskulturkammer, that Laban's fundamental aim is to retain dance, and especially for him, amateur dance, in the realm of art and art making and creativity. And he will not allow it to be swallowed up into the other side of bodily activity, which is physical education, physical training, or Körperkultur. And you can see the correspondence there between himself and Rudolf Bode, where he battles to keep dance as an art activity. So obviously he doesn't want to have anything to do with the Olympic Games as such, and everything to do with amateur dance in the cultural program. And therefore that is his focus. And on that basis he creates Tauwind und der neuen Freude, the huge work, artwork, which took place in 1936. Now, did it take place or did it not take place? That's sometimes a question. Yes and no is the answer. The dress rehearsal took place in June, I think it is. And it was due to have its final performance on the evening before the Games opened. Why did it have a dress rehearsal? Because everything that was put out at that time had to be vetted by the government. Therefore, at that dress rehearsal, which was a public performance to which people were invited, and I put that in inverted commas because, of course, to be invited in those days meant you came. So there was an audience there of people who, some of whom wanted to be there and some of whom stated that they would be there. It was packed, it was full. Now, who comes to see it and vet it? Goebbels and Hitler, both of them. And they look at it, and you only have to look in Goebbels' diary to see his response. He writes there, I saw this thing. He says, it is dressed in our clothes, but has nothing to do with us. I don't like it, it's intellectual, I forbid it. And that was that. So from then on, that work could not be performed for the evening before the opening of the Games, and Laban was immediately in dire trouble.
You know, Laban really believed that he could humanize the Nazi regime. It sounds ridiculous, and he was probably naive, but it was certainly my impression from all the conversations that we had that he felt that he could have an influence for good with these terrible people. And of course, in the immediate post-war period, it was obvious that he was not a war criminal. We wanted to build friendship with the Germans, and the sort of criticism that has begun to appear over the last decade of Laban was just not, didn't seem to be appropriate at that time. Possibly he can be criticized in some ways, and it might appear that he was fraternizing and condoning the Nazi regime. But as I said, I feel that he truly believed that he could bring in this humanizing element and the occasion of the Olympic Games in 1936, when he had planned to have people coming from all over Germany, each group to give something of the tradition of its own locality. This was really a structure where all the hundreds, I believe thousands of people coming from all parts of Germany would be able to do something which was distinctive of their own culture within Germany. And of course, Goebbels said there's room for only one culture, only one movement, so it was cut off. But that, I think, does indicate, perhaps it was naivety that Laban felt that he could get away with this. But of course, it couldn't and wouldn't, and he learnt the hard way.
The Nazis wanted to use the fact that Mary Wigman was an international celebrity for their own purposes. So they asked her to choreograph a dance celebrating the Führer. And that was the point where Mary Wigman suddenly realized that that was not her thing. She was celebrating in her dances life or dance or the experience of living. She was expressing things that moved a person, that moved an individual. She didn't want to celebrate a Führer, not a political person. And so she hesitated and hesitated, and she took her time in hesitating until the Nazis realized that Mary Wigman didn't want to do the thing. And so they revoked the commission. And that was the end of Mary Wigman's career with the Nazi regime. Then she returned to what she'd done before, to her real beliefs in the individual, in the expression of the individual. And she danced solos again, and she danced again the themes of grief, of joy, the things she had danced before in the 20s. And that was the moment where the Nazis said, well, that's degenerate art. And so that was the beginning of Mary Wigman's difficulties with the Nazi regime.
In April of 1934, Leonard and Dorothy Elmhurst offered their beautiful estate at Dartington Hall in the south of England as the new home for the 𝒈𝒐 School.
The question about why did I go to Dartington, to the 𝒈𝒐 School, really the answer rests on my parents having met a friend of theirs who had given a recital at Dartington, and he said, oh, if you know anyone who wants to dance, there's a wonderful school there and this beautiful baronial hall, outdoor theater. And I had told my parents on my 16th birthday that I wanted to dance. And they thought, this sounds like the ideal place. So they insisted that I wait until I was 17, which is why I went to Dartington in January 1936, in the middle of the year. And I think it was the first day somebody said, oh, we're going to have script tomorrow. And I said, script? What script? Oh, you'll find out. And of course it was the Laban notation system. And I feel as though I have spent the rest of my life finding out what script was all about.
When the ballet 𝒈𝒐 left Germany in 1933, Sigurd Leder and Lise Ullmann kept the school going in Essen. In 1934, Leder and Ullmann arrived in Dartington with a group of students from the Folkwang School. In these quiet surroundings, 𝒈𝒐 and Leder finally continued to put into practice their ideas for a contemporary dance department.
It was stressing progressive, intellectual, educational values. It was a rural experiment in agriculture. It had one of the most progressive modern educational co-ed schools. But it was also, and became more and more, an arts department. By the time my father got there, possibly as the first
refugee European artists. My father being father with the colleagues of the school, with his collaborators, and with some members of the company. One of the members of the company, Hein Heckroth, who joined the company to get out of Germany as stage manager. Of course, he was artist and stage designer, and he later had his painting school in Dartington. So Dartington was not a refuge for refugees, but it did gradually turn into a very motley community of course, also, I would think, exceptionally talented people. They were all exceptional in their field, and I think probably the young people that were lucky enough to study at that time or to be around, they were probably quite richly inspired, and there was a lot to learn.
The Ballet Jos now had a new home and financial backing from the Elmhursts. The company was reestablished, and Jos created several new ballets with original music by Cohen and set designs by Heckroth. Jos was well aware of the important role his wife Ino played during his working process. With a critical eye, she would focus on minute details which Kirk would sometimes overlook. From 1935 through 1938, the company embarked on a series of world tours.
One of the very enjoyable things was getting to know the members of the Jos Ballet, Hans Zulich and Elsa Karl, Rudi Pescht, Mr. Uthoff, Ernst Uthoff and Lola Botka. They were around, of course, during the periods of rehearsing, so we got to know them. I also had the pleasure of observing Jos choreographing when he was working on Kronecker, which was a very large, important work for him. I began to notate it, but it was really too big a work to achieve anything. But it was fascinating to see how carefully he created each movement and how his dancers were so responsive. They took on, they molded themselves to whatever he wanted. It was a very different situation in the States, where the choreographer would throw out an idea and the dancers took it over in their own way. For Jos, he really was a complete sculptor in producing the movements. And with Kronecker, one really appreciated it if you could see it several times, because it was like a very detailed tapestry. When it was only seen once by the critics, they didn't get that. He worked in too fine a slate instead of broad, much broader brush strokes.
He was invited by les Archives Internationales de la Danse. I don't know whether it was Rolf de Marais at that time or Pierre Tugal, who was sort of curator and, well, curator, I believe. They invited Laban to come to a conference. Nobody knows anything about this conference, and we suspect that it was a fake, that this conference never took place. But it enabled Laban to obtain whatever he needed to be allowed to exit. And there is also a story that he was not allowed to take anything with him. Maybe he wanted to, you know, take a lot more than was necessary just for that conference. I don't know. But that is how he got out of Germany. It was manipulated by les Archives. That probably somehow Lisa Ullmann knew of his whereabouts, because my father obviously knew where to go to look for him. My father, you know, with the blessings of the Elmhursts at Dartington, went to rescue him and brought him to our home He was a member of our household for over a year. Within this time, just before the outbreak of war, and in 1939 still. When it was sort of to be expected that Laban was recuperating and would also need something to occupy his mind, Father made arrangements, and the Elmhursts offered him a room in the courtyard of, well, a studio, a small studio. And this is where he then began researching crystals. First he would construct and deconstruct the 𝒂𝒂𝒕𝒆. He would research what is inside and what could possibly also be outside the 𝒂𝒂𝒕𝒆. Then he would construct some of these findings in solid crystal form. And then he would open up the solid and investigate the interior of the crystal. There are photographs of this. I used to visit him. He was drawing these crystals all the time too. And I thought it's sort of Laban in his toy shop. It was so amusing for me. And they were beautiful shapes. They were beautifully painted. And this was what he was doing in Dartington at a time where he was completely free. He was respected, he was able to follow his thoughts, there were no obligations, but of course also there was no future. The war had just begun.
Laban came to Dartington, was rescued from Paris, and was quite an ill man at that time. As he recuperated, we were told, you mustn't disturb him, don't bother him. And we would see him. He was given this room in the Barn Theatre. We would see through the glass where he was working on all these shapes, these paper models, icosahedrons and various.
When Laban was at Dartington Hall, he was a guest fundamentally of his pupil, 𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂, although sometimes you do read that he was a guest of the Elmhursts. He wasn't, in fact. Although the Elmhursts did pay a lot of attention to his work. Now, what are the Elmhursts doing there? One of the things they're concerned with is rural industries. They're concerned with the regeneration of rural industries in Devon for their large estate. And they want some help with it. And they ask Fred Lawrence to come down and advise them on their rural industry. That's their woodwork and their fruit picking and their sawmills, all these things. Now Laban happens to be there, and Laban meets up with Lawrence. I suspect they're introduced. I don't know exactly how they met, but I mean they were in the same place at the same time, and I'm sure that the Elmhursts introduced them. So that is how it happened. It was that Lawrence was already engaged, employed, and met up with Laban. And Laban and Lawrence clicked. And Laban saw immediately, if you like, another avenue for his research into human movement. And it must have been a lifesaver for him, not only financially, because at that point he didn't earn, but in terms of a spirit of, at last I can research something. Here I can go forward. And he went forward, of course, on two fronts, which was what is the nature of the work that is being done and the analysis of work, and what is the behavior nature of the worker. And those two things, the person and what the person does, are seen as parallels and equally important. And that then goes straight over, builds eventually into his attitude to dance, his attitude to theatre expression. It's what you do and who you are.
The classes at the 𝒈 School, of course, revolved around the eukinetics, the quality of the movement, choroitics, the space harmony. We had technique classes and also other music, costume subjects such as that. The first year was taught by Marlise Bock when I was there. Lise Ullmann always taught the second years, and Sigurd Leder the third years. He was a fantastic teacher, quite remarkable and unfortunately very unusual. Even his students who wanted to were not able to follow. He had such imagination and creativity, and this was one of the things that was interesting in his use of the notation. He was finding ways of crystallizing the qualities, the subtle differences. But I was one of the few students who really got involved with the notation. There were others who were to become choreographers, Birgit Kuhlberg in particular. I remember she excelled at that time in comedy, amusing dances, and was wonderful. But when she wanted once to do a serious work, somehow it was her own body. There was something about the shape and the way she moved, and she had difficulty in coming across in a serious way. However, of course, later on, in Sweden with her group, she did some wonderful choreographies. Let me see who else was there. There was Amy Saint-Just, who later on came to New York and danced with Agnes de Mille in a Broadway show, as did Lydia Franklin. Rolf Alexander was there and went into the Jos company, as did Ulla Söderbaum, Eva Leckström, several of the others who were in the third year when I was a student there. Lucas Hoving came from Holland toward the end of my period there at the school, and went almost immediately into the Jos Ballet and was with them when they toured the United States. In fact, he stayed on in the States and is mostly known for the work he did with the José Limón Company. While the technique classes at Dartington were structured, and we had studies, this was one of the features that was unusual, and I think Jos continued it later on in Essen-Werden. The studies were worked on like dances, and so you had a chance to finalize it and really refine it. And I found that a wonderful way of working, because going to ballet class, you were given something different every day. You couldn't really work on it, except, I suppose, in the 𝒂𝒂𝒕 method, where they had set exercises. But the ability to do a basic structure and to bring it to your own flavor, so to speak, your own way of doing it, was a feature at the Jos Leder School, and no doubt came from Laban's original preference that people would explore and discover and not be put into a fixed mold. For these classroom studies, which really were études, we found that they were very often created because of a lack in our movement, not sharp enough or not flowing enough or whatever. And Sigurd Leder in particular would create a study, and he had the ability of the whole thing would develop and flow, and they were very enjoyable as well as being practical. He would very often start with a basic idea. I remember there was one that had to do with points of interest, as though there were a little spotlight coming down and just touching your wrist, so the wrist would initiate the movement, or the point of interest would be somewhere else in the body, then eventually this exploration would shape up into a finished study which we would work on to perfect.
Laban and Lisa Ullmann moved to Manchester in 1939 when the war broke out in England. Dartington was a vulnerable coastal area and had to be put off limits. Because of Laban's association with F.C. Lawrence, whose office was in Manchester, Laban and Ullmann decided to open the Art of Movement studio there.
Now, the Art of Movement studio opened in 1946. It couldn't have opened before because of the war. It opened as soon after the war as it was physically possible so to do. It was directed and opened and owned by Lisa Ullmann, not Laban. He was not permitted to have a business in any case. Now, Lisa Ullmann, who was she, and is she an important figure here? Yes, indeed she is. In particular, she was at Dartington Hall already as a member of the staff of Jos and his school, when Laban arrived in 1938, destitute and desperately ill. And it was Lisa Ullmann, really, who I think helped him to survive. I think he would have died. And she gave him courage to start again, if you like, a third 20 years worth of valuable work. So she is, in a sense, the front person, with Laban behind, doing the thinking, and she is the one who presents his work, partly because that is what she is entitled to do as a woman, and he is not as a man, as an alien man during the war. He's severely constricted in what he's allowed to do. So she opens the Art of Movement studio. Now, it's a very strange place, the Art of Movement studio. You know, it's almost impossible for somebody who wasn't there to imagine. It's a decrepit, small building above, I think it was a printing works, in a very poor part of Manchester. It is dirty, it is filthy, in fact. It has nearly no facilities, and a strange group of students, in the first instance just 7. And then when I come in January of 47, at the age of 16, I think during that year it builds up to be 13 students. So it's a tiny group, international. Now, what is the curriculum? Because it really is a rebirth of Laban's German concepts, Bewegungskunst, the arts of movement. So, and it is the arts of movement that he's fundamentally interested in. So yes, he's interested in training people to dance, for dance theatre. He's interested in amateur drama and the dramatic expression. And at the same time, he is earning his living, not through those things, but he's earning his living through looking at the expressive movement and the functional movement of people in industry. So he is bringing his concepts of functional movement and expressive behavior into the training that we undertake as students. Additionally, Lisa Ullmann is earning her living in education, in the training of teachers to teach creative dance to children in our primary schools and secondary schools. So also, her input is primarily to do with education and the training of creative dance. So you've got these 4 things going on in the training: industry, theatre art, education, and everything to do with expressivity. So we don't have anything like technique classes that dancers have today. Yes, we have bodily training in the morning, but it's not important, and it's certainly not taken by Lisa Ullmann or Laban. It's just taken by the students themselves. And then you start and you study choroitics, which is the spatial forms and the harmonic structures of dance, and you study eukinetics, which is the dynamic expressivity dance. And those things you do every day. And then in addition to that, off you go with Laban or with Ormond, according to what is necessary, to work in a school, to work in a theatre, to work in a factory, to teach in a drama course, whatever is needed, you go. In the immediate post-Dartington period, obviously the interest in theatre works is Jos going back to Germany. And left behind here then is Siegfried Leder, who is opening a school using the Jos Leder technique. Now that is Laban's work, his 𝒂𝒂𝒕𝒂𝒄𝒂 and his 𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂 is on the curriculum of the Leder school in the manner in which it is useful to the Jos Leder technique. So it is, if you like, modified in order to enhance the technical training of the dancers in the style of Jos and Leder. Now it's also taught, 𝒂𝒂𝒕𝒂𝒄𝒂 and 𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂 is taught in Manchester in a quite different way, because it is there after creative dance. And so it is taught in the same material is taught in two quite different ways for two quite different purposes. That also influences the manner in which Laban's notation develops, because Siegfried and Jos were both wonderful notators, and they modify and develop the notation in order for their works to be written in a suitable way. And of course, Anne Hutchinson is a student there, and that is what she learns. Now, the notation in Manchester is also taught, but it is taught for quite another purpose, and it is developed entirely for another purpose. In the first instance, it is used to notate industrial actions in factories. It's developed for that. And then it is used and developed to get at the personal movement behavior of individuals. And so he has to develop the effort notation in order to do that.
In England, 𝒂𝒂𝒕𝒂𝒄𝒂 became associated particularly with the work that Laban began with a management consultant called F.C. Lawrence. And Lawrence introduced Laban into factories, and Laban took a lot of observations of efforts. It was a 𝒂𝒂𝒕𝒂𝒄𝒂 concept that Laban believed was appropriate in order to help people to have a better attitude to work, to basically to avoid being made into robots. Laban felt that the mechanistic age was depriving people of their identity, and it was his 𝒂𝒂𝒕𝒂𝒄 theories or effort that he felt would be able to apply a remedy. And so he talked a lot about man's effort, the dignity of effort. And when I came on the scene as an apprentice of Laban's, I only observed efforts, and a theory developed that it was the efforts that enabled you to understand the distinctive way of working of a particular individual. It was the personal effort. In fact, Laban and Lawrence called the work that they were doing at one time personal effort assessment, and that was all that I was doing. And then it seemed to me that there was a lot that people were doing which was being neglected. I mean, Laban knew about people's shaping of movement, and the whole 𝒂𝒂𝒕𝒂𝒄𝒂 concept of something was something, of course, which he had developed particularly over the years. But he associated his 𝒂𝒂𝒕𝒂𝒄𝒂 more with space harmony, with related it to the cosmos. There was very often mystique in connection with 𝒂𝒂𝒕𝒂𝒄𝒂. In dance, they came together, but In other fields, and particularly this field that he referred to primarily as industry, then it was in industry that effort was paramount. And shortly before he died in 1957, I think, I said to him, is there any reason why I should not also take observations of how people were shaping the movement as well as the efforts? And he looked a little surprised, but said, and we had a discussion about it, and he agreed. So it was, I am responsible, I'm afraid, for the term effort shape being promoted. 𝒂𝒂𝒕𝒆 was a student of mine, and on the basis of her work with me, she then set up the effort shape department of the Dance Notation Bureau. And the present Laban 𝒂𝒂𝒕𝒆 Institute of Movement Studies developed from that.
I remember meeting Laban for the first time at one of these weekend holiday events which they offered, and I attended quite frequently. He was a dominating, powerful man. He wasn't all that tall, but he was very broad, and his eyes were very penetrating. And when he said something, you listened. There was no question of maybe arguing about it. At that time, I was very young, and he was very established, and he was the master. And it was what I always imagined the Eastern people have as a real master-apprentice relationship, which is very different from just having a good teacher. He was enormously inspiring, enormously charismatic, and in every way had a kind of point of view which was illuminating. He knew, his vision was so broad, and it was, for me, it was like entering a new world. And of course, I know I never caught up with him. I mean, now, if I knew then what I'd known now, I would have kept records of all our talks. I would have kept photographs and pictures and actions and records. I kept nothing, because for me, by the time I was working with him in Manchester and in Addlestone, it was just somebody I worked with. I knew he was great, I knew he was important. But I think I never really understood until afterwards just how important and how exciting it was to have open discussions with a person of that quality, of his whole attitude to life, with his background, with his enormous range of experiences. And of course, he'd had lots of physical problems, illnesses. And then it's really only recently, in the last 20 years, that we've developed at Laban Center here the development of his work in relation to theatre and performance and choreography, because that was really undervalued in the early days, in the 50s and 60s and 70s. And it's really with Bonnie Bird's influence coming in and joining with me that developed, the whole thing developed. So we actually took the best from America and the best from England and put them together. And that is, I believe, the strength of the centre now. That his interest would be to take a step forward, to invent something, to make something. He was a great inventor, like his notation, for instance. And having done that, his interest began to wane, and he was off on another tack. So he never minded if somebody, like Warren, for instance, said, I'm going to make the Laban lamb. He didn't care that Lamb put his name on it. It didn't matter to him. It was still originating from what Laban had done, even though Lamb made his own variation and idea about it. He never minded that somebody said, oh, I'll go off to New York like Anne Hutchinson and say, set up the Dance Notation Bureau. We'll call it Laban Notation. Yes, go ahead, go ahead. If you said, I think I'd like to go and do this, he said, you go, you go, you go. You do it, you do it. Let me know how you get on, but you do it. So it was always, he initiated something, and then somebody else tended to take it on. And he was lucky if there was somebody there to do it. And in that last period of his life, where I was very closely allied with his writings, he became almost like he was re-energized. He got excited about things that he had been excited about in his early life, and it was like coming around full cycle. I was very privileged because the latest book that he was working on, and still working on when he died, I was collaborating with him, and all my notes about what he gave me, he would give me a chapter and I would talk about it and send it back to him and we would talk about it. And they were all left together, and he hoped to get that one finished in the very near future, but then he was taken too ill. He was ill in the last couple of years of his life. It coincided with my visiting America, and when I got back I found that he was not well, and it was those last 2 years which was very intensive work in spite of his illness, very intensively working on his ideas, and still taking part practically in the studio and the life of the studio and the teaching, which was very exciting for all of us.
Hardly any single person, with the exception of Diaghilev, put the stamp of his genius on the development of the dance during the first half of the 20th century as distinctly as did Rudolf Laban. Walter Sorel. Rudolf Laban died on the 1st of July, 1958, and was buried in Weybridge, England. His gravestone reads, Rudolf Laban, a life for dance.
In 1942, Wigman was removed from her school in Dresden. Gnädigen Gebhardt, the head of the Academy of Dramatic Arts in Leipzig, offered her a position as guest teacher. Wigman taught there until February of 1944, when the dance facilities at the Academy were destroyed by the Allied bombing. She began to use her private residence as a studio, working with a few students who decided to remain in that devastated city. When the war was over and Leipzig fell under the Russian occupation, most of her friends decided to leave and go to the West. She was all alone.
There were questions, of course, as to why Wigman chose to remain in Germany in the 1930s during the rise of Hitler and the Nazi regime. Her good friend, the dance historian Walter Sorel, offered that there were options for her in England or Switzerland or perhaps even the United States. The truth of the matter was probably that Wigman felt great pride in her country. She was born and raised there, and she had achieved a high degree of respect and fame in her home country. She felt that she could say more in dance than she could say in words, and so she chose to remain. She thought, perhaps naively, that things would pass over, but by the late 1930s, the horrors that were to come that she had underestimated were upon the land, and it was too late by that time.
In 1949, Mary Wigman, Kurt Jooss, Rosalia Kladek, and Harold Kreutzberg were invited to participate in an international summer school to be held in Switzerland. It was the first time since the war ended that these master teachers had an opportunity to share experiences and exchange ideas. It was also a chance to present European modern dance to a younger generation. Wigman, Kladek, and Kreutzberg represented the Ausdrucksdance, while Jooss represented dance theater. Shortly before leaving for the summer course in Switzerland, Wigman was given permission to move to West Berlin. The summer course had energized Mary with a new vitality. Her mind had changed since the Second Dancers' Congress. She now believed that modern dance could and should have a place in the theater. Wigman went back to her roots. She applied Laban's use of unadorned basic movements to create archaic simplicity. She began choreographing theater productions for the National Theater in Mannheim. The Oratorio Saal, 1954, in 1955 Catulle Carmina, and Karl Orff's Carmina Burana. In Berlin, in 1957, she staged and choreographed Stravinsky's La Sacre Printemps with Dora Hoyer as soloist. Alcestis, 1958, in Mannheim. Her last choreography for the theater was Orpheus and Eurydice, directed by Gustav Sellner, the renowned opera director in Berlin. She stopped working in the theater and devoted her time to teaching in her school in Berlin.
To Margaret Erlanger, Berlin, April 21st, 1967. I'm going to retire from work at the end of our summer term. Then the Wigman studio will close its doors. I'm not even sad about it, though it doesn't mean an end of a long period, but I have got to feel the limits of my strengths. 1968. It gets more difficult to get old with dignity. My doctor tries to make it easier for me. Sometimes we joke about it, but the biological fact cannot be denied. February 1970. When I'm sitting at my desk, as at this moment, warmly dressed, when the light is switched on and I can feel the silence outside and inside, I am a happy old woman, and this is quite something.
Death was no stranger to Mary Wigman. In fact, death was a principal theme in much of her work. She accepted death as a part of the human condition, and the last 10 years of her life were lived very much in its shadow.
In 1949, Kurt Jooss was asked by the city of Essen to give an international summer dance course at the 𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂 school. The event turned out to be a huge success, attracting dancers not only from Europe, but from North and South America as well. The popularity of this event led the city to ask Jooss to resume his old job as director of the dance department at the 𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂 school. The city agreed to support an independent dance theater similar to the one he had in 1932. However, in 1953, the city withdrew its support, and the company had to disband. Jooss then devoted himself to full-time teaching. He established summer programs inviting leading European and American teachers to the 𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂 school. His aim, as always, was to give the student a wide exposure to different styles and techniques. In 1959, Jooss joined the director and designer of the Essen Opera in the Schwetzinger Festival production of Purcell's The Fairy Queen. Jooss had always approached each choreography with an appropriate dance language. For example, in The Green Table, he used weight impact as an expressive tool. In The Fairy Queen, he emphasized lightness, mixing classical legwork with the fluidity of modern dance. The British critic A.V. Cotton, familiar with Jooss's work during the Dartington years, pointed out a recent development in his work, a blend of dramatic approach with balletic classicism. For Kurt Jooss, the 60s was a time of many accomplishments. He formed the 𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂 Ballet in 1961, the fulfillment of an idea he had had for many years. He initiated a master class in the 𝒂𝒂𝒂 Schule, which would form the core of that ballet company. His star pupil, Pina Bausch, was called back from America to become one of its soloists. Choreographers such as Anthony Tudor and Lucas Hoving mounted new works for the fledgling company. Jooss also choreographed several new pieces. The 𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂 Ballet performed throughout Europe and was the first dance company to perform in East Germany. Jooss retired in 1968 and the company disbanded. The 60s was also a time of renewed interest in Jooss's works. Robert Joffrey asked Jooss to restage The Green Table. Ultimately, the Joffrey Ballet revived the original program for Jooss's 75th birthday in 1976. Big City, Pavan, Ball in Old Vienna, and The Green Table. Kurt Jooss foresaw a time when he could no longer continue working at such an accelerated pace, and so his daughter Anna began working with him, learning to reconstruct and interpret the original notated scores. Anna Marquard assumed the entire production work in 1972. In 1971, after a long illness, his wife Aino died. Kurt Jooss moved to southern Germany, where he died in 1979. He was 78 years old.
Michael Diekamp, a professor of dance at the Palluca School in Dresden, carries on the pedagogic and artistic heritage of Kurt Jooss.
I have the feeling that I got from Jooss the understanding that dance is a language, a human language. Also, the awareness of quality in movement, clarity and taste. And through Jooss' teaching and his work, one became sensitive for the right movement, if a movement is right or wrong in a certain connection. And if one reaches once these professional standards, one cannot leave them, and it's almost like you are not able to leave them.
I think that we can easily say now in the 21st century that one of the lead geniuses of the 20th century was Rudolf von Laban. His mind, his curiosity coincided with a time, historically, in which great curiosity about the analysis of movement, about the physical universe and physical space came together. So his thinking very much legitimized even such work as artistic movement, that is, movement for expression. He attracted accordingly other people who had interests, intellectual interests and physical interests in the arts and in the sciences. And it's one of those unique times that brings together art and science in a very agreeable way. He can very much be credited with that. He was truly a restless genius, we can say that as well. One who had many ideas and not always the complete patience, perhaps, to follow them through. But having attracted many very intelligent and very thoughtful and sensitive people to him, they carried out the work in really remarkable ways. So he can be credited with the theory and the initial genius, and equally his students, his devotees, can be credited with describing many of the implications and the uses from the ideas that he had introduced. The two prime students that are often named, but not the only ones, Mary Wigman and Kurt Jooss, they carried out many of the explorations of the ideas that Laban had articulated earlier in their artistic forms. I first became aware, for example, of the influence that Mary Wigman had in articulating the idea of the movement qualities, not just as descriptors, but as really physiological phenomena that inform human movement. And that was expressed artistically through her work that then came to me a generation later through the person of Margaret Erlanger, she being the founder of the dance program at the University of Illinois. So through the artistic form as well as the other analytical forms begins to be this broadening out and this joining together and this merging of the American modern dance movement and the German and Laban-centered movement, with wonderful coincidences occurring and reinforcements along the way. The work of Kurt Jooss has been carried out not only by himself with works that have influenced American choreographers and the aesthetics of dance throughout Europe and America, but by then his students, Pina Bausch being particularly notable among those many students and those who were influenced by Kurt Jooss. That all demonstrates further the revolutionary quality of the ideas that were carried by this initial genius of Laban. The ideas themselves continually revolutionize and bring new ideas and fresh spirit and fresh expression to what is going on. This is truly exceptional. And of course, the nature of the ideas carries out in artistic forms and in educational forms as well. Many of the students of Laban made no differentiation, really, between education and artistic activity, but rather the two fed each other and continued to grow, that being a part of Laban's idea right to begin with. And one thinks that 𝒃𝒂𝒏𝒂𝒍 probably embodies that as wonderfully as anybody in the whole succession from the ideas there. Certainly at the Folkwangschule in Essen had been carried out the ideas of education, that human expression is itself education, and that it requires that deep kind of education for us to have greater insights not only into the various art forms, modern dance and ballet as well, and folk dance as well, but that is the material of the whole human spirit and of understanding the whole human heart and soul, if you will. That's a very strong impetus, too, that is carried out by this rich and wonderful tradition. There is a wonderful coincidence of the American School of Dance Education and the succession from Laban in Germany that can be told many times because it has many nuances. Through Mary Wigman, for example, had come the great dancer and choreographer Hanya Holm, sent to New York to set up a Wigman studio. And Hanya's influence was quite profound in New York at a time when New York was quite ready for fresh ideas in the modern dance realm, in the dance realm in general. Then from Hanya Holm, therefore, was a succession of the Wigman ideas, but also Hanya's own ideas. We can certainly say that. And the expansion further among her students who became or already were growing as artists and even as educators as well. So we have Alan Nicolai, for example, coming from Hanya Holm, Don Redlich, superb solo dancer studying a long time with Hanya Holm, and many, many others who can and should be named. Not least of all is the importance of the elevation of dancer and dancing as a worthy profession. Certainly Laban had a great deal to do with that. Before his time, dancers and actors and other performance people, of course, were considered only a cut above, if that, circus performers and street performers and the likes. But he certainly saw it as a noble profession and as a noble process of understanding the human condition in human beings and of understanding ourselves through the educational aspects as well as the artistic aspects. So we can very much, again, thank his ideas and his genius for elevating the stature of the dancer and certainly bringing the dance as an art form up to a par and a level with the other art forms.
The trend of dance now and in the near future, and at least in the near future, will be of bringing the different currents together into the one mainstream of one art of dancing. It can't go on with two arts of dancing, a modern art and a classical art of dancing. That is rubbish to my mind. And I have all my life tried to achieve that the tradition which we call classical ballet. What is classical ballet is what for at least 3 centuries great artists in the past have achieved, have built up, and have found out and have brought together as a coherent system.
Yeah.
Well, we are not in our rights to throw that away. We would be fools if we would do it, because there is this beautiful and most valuable material which none of us can sort of create out of a moment, but it's the result of a couple of hundred great artists in dance, and that cannot be abandoned. Of course, there are people nowadays who think everything must begin at Adam and Eve and so on. Something entirely new must come. There is nothing entirely new.